I think we should get started, and people will join us as they can. So my name is Noah Slepkov. I will be moderating this event. I am a co-author of the Pluralism Index with Shmuel. We've been doing it for several years now. This will be the first year that we're joined by Professor Yedidia Stern, who will make some opening remarks. Let me just introduce him for those of you who might not be familiar with him, although you probably all should be. Professor Yedidia Stern is president of the Jewish People Policy Institute and a professor in the Faculty of Law at Bar-Ilan University. He holds a law degree from Bar-Ilan University and a doctorate in corporate law from Harvard University. Previously, he served as dean of Bar-Ilan University's Faculty of Law and was a senior fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute, and later served as their vice president for research. We're fortunate for him to be now at JPPI, and I'll let him take over.
Noah, shalom for everybody from Jerusalem. Very happy to see some familiar faces and some not so familiar faces. Everybody is obviously welcome. Noah and Shmuel Rosner are responsible for the show tonight of the Pluralism Index. This is the 7th time I understand that JPPI is conducting this index, and I would like to thank the Davidson Foundation that allowed this to happen. It is highly appreciated. Thank you very much. Now, the good news are that Israelis feel comfortable to live in Israel. As we will see in the data, 86% of Jews and 79% of Israeli Arabs feel comfortable in Israel. I can add that 81% of the citizens of the State of Israel do not want to immigrate from Israel, even if they will have the option. This is very encouraging. They feel at home, they want to stay here, even if they have an alternative. Nevertheless, there is a cloud over us. It is not only the shadow of the pandemic, and it is not just the political crisis. You know, we enjoy 4 elections in 2 years. It is something much deeper than current events. We are suffering, I believe, from a chronic lack of cohesion in our society, and I think this is our main challenge. Israeli society is made out of 4 major groups. We call it sometimes 4 tribes. Each one is having a different vision for the State of Israel. The dream of one of these tribes is sometimes the nightmare of the other. Generally speaking, secular believe that Israel should be a nation state. Haredim, ultra-Orthodox, believe that Israel should be a religious state. Religious Zionists prefer a third option, a national religious state, which is not a compromise, it's a different option. And Israeli Arabs say that there should be no connection between Judaism and the state. They believe that Israel should be a neutral state, not a Jewish one. Now, no one of these 4 tribes has hegemony in Israel. The largest one is a secular one, but it is about a little bit more than 1/3 of the population. Then you have the Israeli Arabs, and then you have the Haredim, and then you have the religious Zionists. None of these 4 sectors or groups or tribes can ascertain itself that their discretion about the future of the State of Israel will apply. Additionally, the Israeli conversation is happening without any binding rules. We do not have a constitution. So we do not have rules for the game that are binding all of us in a serious way. And we are conducting our different views in an open discussion that takes place, I think, over shifting sands. On top of it, the confidence of Israelis in the organs of the state is not so high and it's declining. And as we all know, our political system is not the best one, not to say a broken one. Now, in our Pluralism Index, we want to identify long-term trends that will expose the main points of consensus and disagreement in Israeli society. This information is crucial for us for the work we want to do, because we try to plan policy for the Jewish people at large. I would like to pick only one main point regarding the definition of the state as a Jewish state. Interestingly enough, 98 to 99% of Israeli Jews believe that Israel should be a Jewish state. Only 1 to 2%, mainly intellectuals, believe that Israel should not be, out of the Jews, should not be a Jewish state. However, there is a major disagreement about the implementation of this abstract idea in reality. 53% of secular Jews want Israel to be less Jewish. However, 90% of the religious want Israel to be more Jewish. Needless to say that huge majority, 91% of Israeli Arabs think that Israel, if it wants to be a real democracy, should not be a Jewish state, but a state of all its citizens. So the majority of the citizens of the state of Israel are not satisfied today with the current situation of Israel as a Jewish state. Some say it is too Jewish, and some say that it is not Jewish enough. So one may say that this wealth of opinions in Israel is one of its treasures, and I agree. But somebody else would say that this wealth of opinions has also the potential to disintegrate our society, and again, I agree to that as well. I believe that the ongoing dispute regarding the vision of the state is a strategic threat for the well-being of the state and for the well-being of Israeli society. And it should be addressed seriously by all of us. And I think that JPPI wants to play a major role in this effort. So these are opening remarks, and I would like to thank everybody for participating. And now the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I will now introduce Shmuel Rosner. I'm sure all these introductions are not necessary for you all on Zoom, but the people who will be watching this on YouTube and Facebook later, this is for them. So Shmuel Rosner is a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute. He is a news commentator on Israel's public broadcaster, Kan News. He is the editor of the Madad.com, one of Israel's most promising data journalism startups. He is the nonfiction editor for Israel's largest publishing house, Kinneret Zimor Bitan Devir. He is a senior political editor for the Jewish Journal, and he writes for the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv and a small paper out of New York called the New York Times. Shmuel and I have worked on this now for several years, and I'll let him take over from here and give the presentation.
Thank you, Noah. I put the presentation on screen, and I also apologize that I'm a little bit under the weather, so if my voice sounds odd, I apologize for this, and I will drink tea from time to time, and I also apologize for that. What you see at the first slide here, and we are going to go through many slides, some of which are self-explanatory and some of which need more elaboration. This is something that Professor Stern already mentioned, the level of comfortability of Israeli Jews and Arabs in Israel. These are the numbers for this year, and these are the numbers starting from 2016. What you see here, the one significant difference that you see here is a slight decrease in the comfortability of non-Jews in Israel. We aren't sure if this is because we used a different pollster for the Arab sector this year, or because of other factors, one of which can be the ongoing cycles of election and the ongoing debate within Israel about participation of Arabs in Israel's social and political life. So this might have been a factor in the way Arabs responded to the question this year. My presentation will mainly be comprised of three main parts. We will see some general information about Israel and its groups. We will deal with sentiments and ideas about the shared future of Jews and Arabs in Israel, and also Jews in Israel and Jews elsewhere. We will talk about the concept of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, what Professor Stern also mentioned. And lastly, we will see a few cases, high-level cases of disagreements with Israel and how they are translated into public opinion. So I begin with general data about Israel. This is not much different than what we've seen in previous years. At JPPI, we divide Israelis by religiosity to 7 groups. That's more than most other institutions do. Some do 4, some do 5. We have 7 because it enables us to have a more nuanced ability to analyze the different groups. You see that according to our measurements, about half of all Jews in Israel, not all Israelis, all Jews in Israel, about half are secular. These are 2 groups, totally secular and secular traditional Israelis. Then we have traditional and the different groups of religious and ultra-religious groups. Political identification in Israel also unchanged from recent years. Israel, when it comes to the Jews in Israel, is a right-wing society. Between 55 and 60% of all Jews in Israel are self-defined as right or center-right. Then about a quarter are centrists, and the center-left and left are very small, especially the left. It's 5%. In some polls, it's 7%, but that's the share of left-wing Jewish Israelis. Among Arabs, as you can see, which includes, it's not just Arabs, it's non-Jews, which include Arabs, Druze, and Bedouins. You see, again, many people on the left, also many people who do not want to share their political beliefs, and very few located on the right and the center. This is the division of non-Jews in our poll by Muslim, Druze, and Christian, and the more important division by religiosity. You see that the non-Jewish society in Israel is fairly religious, and this is something that people tend to not remember or to ignore. It's not only Jews in Israel who are fairly traditional, it is also Arabs in Israel who are fairly traditional. And when we will look later at the question of state and religion in Israel, whether people want to separate state and religion, you will see that the numbers for Jews and Arabs are very similar on this issue, because we have the same basic contours of Jewish and Arab society, with about a third being religious and ultra-religious. Now I move to the second part of what I wanted to show you, and that's the issue of shared future and attachment. Basically, we looked at Jews and non-Jews in Israel, and for each of them, we looked at 2 different circles of attachment: Jews and non-Jews in Israel for both groups, and then Jews and Jews outside of Israel, Arabs and Arabs outside of Israel. So I begin with Jews, and we ask two basic questions. One, do you agree or disagree that there is a shared future for all Israelis, Jews and Arabs? And the second question was more emotional. It was about, do you feel attachment to all Israelis, Jews and non-Jews? As you can see here, when it comes to shared future with Israelis, most Israeli Jews agree. Shared future with other Jews, even more Jewish Israelis agree. Attachment to other Jews is the highest level answer that you see here. 72% of Jews in Israel say that they do feel emotional attachment to Jews in other countries. That's a very important finding, with some caveats that we will talk about later. And you see that attachment to other Israelis, namely the attachment of Jews to non-Jews in Israel, is relatively low, which we interpret as the sense of Jewish Israelis that on the practical level, there is a shared future for all of us. You know, we live in the same country, the same state. So Jews and Arabs in Israel, factually speaking, do share a future, but this doesn't yet translate into real attachment to other Israelis, namely of Jews to non-Jews in Israel. Now, here's one slide that describes the differences between political groups in Israel among Jews and their sense of having a shared future with Arabs. And as you can see here on the right, and we already said the right in Israel is about 30% of Jews, more than 30% of Jews. On the right, we see a majority, a slight majority, who don't see even a shared future with non-Jews in Israel, not to mention attachment or real sentiment. The further we move leftward, so to speak, to the center right and the center and the left, the more Jews in Israel feel that they do have a shared future with non-Jews in Israel. When we look at the attachment or the way Jews in Israel look at other Jews outside of Israel, we see almost a mirror image of this graph here. It's not by political affiliation, it's by religiosity, but religiosity and political affiliation go hand in hand in Israel. It's very similar. And as you can see here, what we get is the opposite. The attachment of the more religious people to Jews outside of Israel is the strong attachment or the strong sense of a shared future. But the 30%, 31% of the totally secular Israelis, there is a majority who do not think there is a shared future for Jewish Israelis and for Jews outside of Israel. So again, on shared future with the Arabs, it goes from right to left or from left to right. On shared future with other Jews, it goes in the opposite direction from right to left. And these two things are, of course, significant in many ways. Now I'm looking at the Arabs in Israel. And again, we asked questions about shared future and about attachment, both to other Israelis, namely to Jewish Israelis, and to other Arabs, namely Arabs who live outside of Israel. As we can see here, for Arabs in Israel, there is a sense both of attachment and shared future for all groups. The stronger attachment is for other Arabs, but still a fairly strong attachment to other Israelis as well, and a sense of a shared future with other Israelis and also with other Arabs. I'll skip this one so we have time for other things as well. So now we move to another part, and that's the issue of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And we looked at different variants of this question. We asked the question in many different ways. I'm not going to show you all the data On our website, there is a long 6,000 word document analyzing more of the data that you are free and welcome to read. What we see here is the basic question: how democratic should Israel be? And these are the questions of, these are the answers of Jews in Israel by political affiliation. And what you see here are two basic things. One, there's no one in Israel who doesn't want Israel to be a democracy. Maybe some radical lunatic at the very far somewhere. But by and large, when you survey a representative sample of Israelis, Jews and Arabs, you don't find people who say, no, I don't want Israel to be a democratic state. Everybody wants Israel to be democratic. We will immediately look at the interpretation of what it means to be democratic. But first, we need to acknowledge the fact that democracy is still a strong word and a strong sentiment in Israel. The second thing that we see here, that a very large share of Israelis not only want Israel to be democratic, they want Israel to be what they believe is more democratic than what it is today. Satisfaction with Israeli democracy as it is today is mostly noticeable on the right and the center right, but from the center to the left, you see many people, and also a fairly large minority, about a third of right-wingers and center-right-wingers, who want Israel to be more democratic than it is today. Now, what is democracy? We gave people a variety of options, and we asked them, what are the conditions that must exist for a state to be considered a democracy? You just said that you want Israel to be a democracy. What does it mean? And what we see here, I think, is a fairly, a picture that I see as a fairly rosy picture. There are many things on which Jews and non-Jews agree. They all want democracy. Well, what is democracy? 95% of them agree that democracy necessitates human rights. About 80% of them agree that democracy means majority rule. Close to 90% of them agree that there should be no discrimination in a democracy of certain groups. I should add, we don't have here on the slide, but same goes for having an independent judiciary, something that almost everybody agrees on. Where do we see somewhat of a disagreement? On the question of separation of religion and state. Still, there is a majority of Jews and Arabs. Here you see the similarity between these two societies. The majority who say separate religion and state. I interpret this statement more as a statement expressing dissatisfaction with the religious institutions and establishment than it is a thought-through process of wanting to have a real separation like the one you have in the United States. Nevertheless, almost 2/3 of Jews and Arabs say separate religion and state. About a third, Jews and Arabs disagree and say we do not need to separate, or separation of religion and state is not a necessity for a country that strives to be a democratic country. Now we move to the other part of the equation, Jewish and democratic. We talked about the democratic state. Now let's look at the Jewish state. And we asked questions about the Jewish state, mostly Jews. Most Arabs in Israel do not want Israel to be a Jewish state. They want Israel to be a state of all of its citizens, a neutral state, so to speak. Among Jews, and this, I was somewhat surprised by the numbers here, because there is, in intellectual circles and maybe some newspapers, there is a lot of talk about the supposed possibility of Israel becoming a neutral state or not keeping itself as a Jewish state the way it used to be, as if Zionism fulfilled its main mission and we no longer need a Jewish state, so to speak. As you can see here, this is a marginal view. A very small percentage of the totally secular agree with it. It's between 1% and 2% of Jews say that they don't want Israel to be a Jewish state, which means 99% of Jews, I think Professor Stern mentioned it, 99% of Jews want Israel to be a Jewish state. Now, this doesn't mean that they don't have different interpretations of what it means to be a Jewish state, but we still have something to build on. There is a common agreement that we want something that we call a Jewish state, and now we can begin talk about the question what it means to be a Jewish state, and we will see what it means in a second. Also note that here we see a more equal division between people who say they want Israel to be more Jewish and those who want Israel to be less Jewish. You don't see it exactly in the slide, but remember that these groups are not identical in numbers. So the two secular groups are larger groups, and the fact that about half of the totally secular and a quarter of the somewhat secular want Israel to be less Jewish is significant, and it means that we pretty much have about a third who want Israel to be Jewish as it is today, and the other 2/3 are split between those who want Israel to be more Jewish and those who want Israel to be less Jewish. Now, what is a Jewish state? Again, we run through the same exercise. We gave different definitions or conditions that must be met for a state to be Jewish. And you can clearly see what are the stronger and less strong agreements. A Jewish majority, that's something that almost all Jews, 90% of Jews almost agree on. This is something that we need to have to preserve a Jewish state. Encourage creation of Jewish culture is something that 3 out of 4 Jewish Israelis agree on. To consider Jews abroad, to take care of Jews who live outside of Israel. Again, 70%, this is fairly high. And we see around 60% who say that a Jewish state must preserve Jewish values, which of course raises the follow-up question, what are Jewish values? But again, it's something we can talk about because many of us agree that Jewish values is something that a Jewish state must do. Here's where we see some of the difficulties, or one of the major difficulties with this expression of wanting a Jewish state. One of the things that we asked about is whether a Jewish state should give preference, legal preference, to Jews over Arabs. And you see the result on the right and the center right. There is a clear majority of people who think that a Jewish state must give legal preference to Jews over Arabs. This, there is a contradiction here between, because we just saw in the previous question about the democratic state that there is a clear majority of Jews who say there should be no discrimination in a democratic state, and we want a democratic state. Now we suddenly see that when we speak about the Jewish state, they want some kind of legal discrimination or legal preference, which ultimately is also discrimination. It is a contradiction, and it is a contradiction that we must look at and deal with. People aren't always consistent in the way they answer questions in a survey, and this is what we see. And you know, we must look at it with sober and sober eyes, understand what it means, and try to work with it. Now I move to the last part of my presentation. Let me look at the watch and take a sip of tea. Here we ask questions about different topics that are controversial in Israel, in some way were controversial or are still controversial. The first of which is the nation state law. As I assume most of you, if not all of you know, 3 years ago, Israel passed a highly controversial basic law, the nation state law, that declares Israel to be the state of the Jewish people and has some other elements to it. It came under heavy criticism from the people opposing the law and from minorities in Israel. The law passed with 62 out of 120 members of Knesset voted for the law. And when we asked Jews and non-Jews in Israel, do you support the law, the current version of the law, because there were suggestions to alter the legislation, to just add a few elements that will make it better. So we asked specifically about the current version of the nation state law. And as you can see, a slight majority of Jews support the law, a majority somewhat reminiscent of the majority that passed the legislation just a few years ago, while a vast majority of non-Jews in Israel oppose the nation state law. Now, what we kept doing with these controversial issues, we decided not just to ask, are you for or against it? We also wanted to measure the level of intensity with which people support or oppose a certain topic. So for each topic on which we asked, are you against or for, we also asked, how important is this topic for you? And as you can see here, on the issue of the nation state law, there is a slight advantage for supporters among Jews. This is only for Jews. Among supporters of the law, there is a slight advantage of intensity, which means it's more important for those who support the law to support it than it is for opponents of the law to oppose it. This is among Arabs, and as you can see, among Arabs, 58%, almost two-thirds say it is a very important, and these are the people who are against the law, say it's very important. So the intensity of opposition to the law amongst non-Jews in Israel is very high. Another question, similar thing, this is Jews only. Are you for or against withdrawal from territories for a political settlement? This basically talks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Jews only, as you can see, a clear majority, clear two-thirds majority oppose any withdrawal from territories, any evacuation of settlements, at least as an idea. You know, maybe if we bring to the table something more concrete, the views of people could change. But for now, when we ask this simple question, evacuate territory for peace agreement, we have a clear majority against evacuation. And we also see that the intensity of the opposition is much, much higher. 64% of the opponents say that the issue is very important for them, while only a quarter of the proponents of evacuation say it's very important for them. There is a larger share who say it's important, not very important, but clearly the intensity is on the opposition side and not on the with the people who say evacuation is necessary and we support it. Another such issue, support for the Supreme Court. Again, we asked a very specific question. There are many controversies surrounding the Supreme Court or the High Court in Israel. I don't want to get into all the details, but as one, we chose one of them, and that's the power of the court to strike down laws passed by the Knesset. This is a controversial issue in Israel. I know in the United States, this was decided, I think in 1800 or maybe 1801 by the Supreme Court. In Israel, it was decided in the much more recent past, and there's many Israelis who think that the power of the Supreme Court to strike laws passed by the Knesset should be limited. We do see that there is a slight majority for supporters of the power, the established power of the Supreme Court, but the level of opposition is quite significant, 46%, and the level of intensity is somewhat similar on both camps, maybe with slight advantage for those who support the court over those who oppose the court. Public transportation on Shabbat. As you can see, we go from more political, foreign policy issues and security, then to legal issues. Now we are in the religion and state arena. So public transportation on Shabbat, I'm sure you know, we don't have it on Israel, or not on a large scale. Support for public transportation on Shabbat is very high. It's been high for quite some time. As you can see, 2/3 of Israelis, which basically means all secular Israelis and most traditional Israelis, support public transportation on Shabbat. You can also see here that the intensity of support is high, much higher than the intensity of opposition for transportation on Shabbat, which must raises the question, okay, so if people support it and with high intensity, why isn't it happening? And this goes back to the way our political system is built and the inherent power of smaller parties to influence some topics of high importance for them if other parties don't make it a priority. So we do see an intensity of support for public transportation, but we do have to say that up until now, most parties did not make it the highest priority for themselves if they enter a coalition, and that's why we don't yet see a change. Same goes for civil marriage in Israel. The support for civil marriage in Israel is high. It's 2/3 of the population who support it. They also support it with high intensity. 50% of them say it's very important. Again, this is a clear case in which we see how the way the political system is built works against the wish of the people. Now, of course, political systems in all countries are built on compromises between what's important and what's possible, and there are trades and give and takes. So I'm not saying that, I'm not saying this to denigrate or criticize the Israeli political system. Unlike Professor Stern, I'm not sure that there are political systems much better than Israel's. Certainly, I'm not sure that the system in the United States is much better than Israel's. But whatever you think about this topic, we see here a situation in which the majority wants civil marriage, the majority supports civil marriage with high intensity, and the majority doesn't get his wish. Last topic, the enlistment of yeshiva students to the IDF. This is basically about Haredis, ultra-Orthodox youngsters serving in the IDF. You can see that the numbers here are tremendous, just one-sided, 80% to 20%. But you see that in the column of the Haredi Israelis, it's 80% opposition to enlistment. And again, that's why we don't have it, because for Haredis, this is a very high priority. And although we see that it's a priority for other Israelis, Haredis have fewer topics that they see as their main priority. So the cards that the political cards that they have, they use them to prevent Israel from enlisting young Haredis to the IDF. And again, we see a case in which the majority, the vast majority, 80% of Israelis do not get what they want. I will just add that about service in the IDF or national civil service, we ask not only Jews, but also Arabs, because whenever the issue of enlistment of Haredis to national service is raised, people are asking, well, why not non-Jews? Why not Arabs? Why will they not serve, if not in the IDF, then at least do some kind of national service? We see that the opposition among Arabs to having national service for themselves is almost as high as the opposition of Haredis to having national service for Haredis. So in some way, we see a convergence of interest between Haredis and Arabs on this issue of national service. For both these groups, it is somewhat beneficial that Israel did not enforce legislation or rules that make all Israelis, that enforce all Israelis to join some kind of national service. It's good for both these groups that there are exceptions. And this can lead to all kinds of interesting political agreements and political cooperative formulations within Israel. We see it now with their Islamist Ram party and the how close it gets to the ultra-Orthodox parties. We might see it in other instances as well. I will conclude here and give it back to you, Noah.
All right. The only thing I want to correct you on is that the length of the document is 10,000 words, not 6,000 words. So now
it's 6,000 in Hebrew, the original language, which translates
7,800, but who's counting? Okay, we're going to get some comments now from our co-chairs. So I'm going to, again, I know these introductions are superfluous, so I'm going to do them anyways. Ambassador Dennis Ross is co-chairman of JPPI's Board of Directors and Professional Guiding Council. He served as special assistant to President Barack Obama and the NSC Senior Director for Central Region. Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East and was the point man on the peace process in both the George W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. Dennis, please give us your thoughts.
Well, look, I think this is a very interesting set of insights that the numbers reveal. I want to pick up on what Shmuel really noted at the end. It is striking that there are some interesting convergences between the ultra-Orthodox attitudes and the Arab attitudes. And I think what's noteworthy is whether or not that implies that we're going to see some greater cooperation between them. We didn't see it in the past. We certainly are seeing it now in terms of the possibility of government formation, where the idea, whether you're talking about Mansour Abbas's party, Ram, or you're talking about the Joint List, pretty hard to put together a government without one of those parties being prepared to provide a kind of safety net for a government. And we've also seen this last election an effort to reach out to the Arabs as well. So I guess maybe a question I have is, do we see some greater potential for integration right now of the Arabs? What's been striking for some time is the Arabs, although the numbers, as you said, changed a little bit this time, and you're not quite certain why. Israeli Arabs have had a high sense of being comfortable in Israel. They reflect themselves as being happy as to be Israeli citizens. Is this sense of their being integrated, do you see this now as a more likely trend? Do the numbers indicate greater acceptability on the part of the Jewish Israelis to Israeli Arabs playing that role? And let me just add to that, has the fact that 20% of the Israeli doctors are Arab, 30% of the pharmacists are Arab, given the pandemic, has that changed Jewish perceptions of Israeli Arabs and how they should be integrated into Israel? I pose that as a question.
Noach, you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
To answer. So
answer the question, and we'll go to Stu.
Okay, I just this morning I had a very interesting conversation with our pollster, Professor Camil Fuchs, and we discussed some of our findings and also other things that that I saw in other places. And Camil told me something that's very interesting. He said, note that we see two groups moving in different directions. Russian Israelis are moving leftward, Arab Israelis are moving rightward. These are moving in different path. The more Russian-born Israelis or second-generation Russian Israelis are becoming integrated into the Israeli society, the more they feel comfortable moving leftward, especially so because of matters related to religion and tradition, because they are much more secular than most Israelis. And with the Arabs, we see the opposite. Suddenly, their sense of being more traditional, more conservative on issues ranging from gay marriage to state religion affairs, etc., it causes them to move rightward and to try to make amends with the right-wing traditional coalition in Israel, which is a coalition of Likud and the ultra-Orthodox parties and some other parties. Now, is this going to happen quickly? I don't think it's happening very quickly, but we see a slow move towards we see such trend. I don't think it's stopping anytime soon. I think that the issue of that you raised, the issue of doctors and nurses and engineers and pharmacy, you know, life in Israel are integrated in many ways. When you walk out the door and go to the supermarket or to the pharmacy or to the hospital, God forbid, you know, there are Jews and Arabs everywhere. So I do think it's influencing our the way we think about the way Jews think about Arab Israelis. The only factor that stands in the way is the Palestinian issue. The more Arabs are willing to put aside the Palestinian issue and talk about internal Israeli affair, and the more the Palestinian issue is just, you know, on the sidelines because of global developments and doesn't raise its hand, the more it becomes easy for Jews and Arabs in Israel to feel that integration is the right path for them.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat is co-chairman of JPPI's Board of and Professional Guiding Council and currently heads the international practice of the Covington and Burlington law firm. In the past, he served as U.S. Ambassador to the EU, Under Secretary of State, Under Secretary of Commerce, and Deputy Secretary of Treasury. Ambassador Eizenstat, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I want to congratulate Noah and Shmuel and JPPI on this really important index. It's unique to us at JPPI and very important, I think, in terms of policy. I come away with several positive conclusions, some questions, and then some concerns. On the positive side, the fact that a majority of Arabs and Jews feel that they have a shared future is very important. In addition, the fact that a majority of Israeli Jews feel they have a shared future with the diaspora is very important because one of the key features of JPPI is the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. Question which, Shmuel, you addressed, but it is of some concern, and that is the percentage of non-Jews, mostly Arabs, who feel comfortable in Israel. While it's close to 70% in 2021, it's a quite precipitous drop from 85% in 2020, 85% in 2019, almost 80% in 2018. You mentioned maybe a different methodology and so forth, but that is a question of a concern. With respect to the diaspora and diaspora-Israel relations, this really solidifies the notion that Israel is a center-right country, which is what you've said, Shmuel. I think it's quite clear that diaspora Jews are center-left, and this has the prospect, therefore, of widening differences. It is also a more religious country, at a time when Jews are perhaps moving in a secular direction. Troubling as well is that 2/3 of Israelis do not support the notion of withdrawal from territories for political settlement. And that's asked so generally. If it had been asked some territories, would that have elicited a different response? I'm not sure it's as sophisticated a question as one might have hoped. Also troubling from a diaspora Israel relationship is that barely half support the Supreme Court of Israel having the opportunity to overturn legislation. And this means that perhaps if a center-right government comes into power, the erosion of Supreme Court power may be something that's a wedge issue. And last, a question that's not asked, and it was just alluded to in your response, perhaps in the future surveys, it would be very interesting to ask Israeli Arabs in particular, how important is the Palestinian issue to you? Is there an erosion? I mean, the UAE and others have basically said, we're going our own way, you've had your chance. How much of an attachment to the Palestinian issue do Israeli Arabs have, and has that eroded over time? That perhaps that's asked in another context, but I didn't see it here, and it would be a very interesting question to ask for the future. But again, on a net basis, this is a tremendously important and insightful study. And Yedidia, I think it's one that we thank, again, as you did, the Davidson Foundation, Ralph Gerson and others for supporting. And it shows, I think, in a distinctive way, one of the contributions that JPPI makes.
Thank you. I would just add on the Palestinian issue, we do ask a question about main identity, and we give the option of, is their main identity Palestinian? Is their main identity Israeli? Is it Arab Israeli? And the identity of having an identity based on Palestinian is actually quite low compared to the other identities. It's not exactly the question you're suggesting, but it's a proxy for it.
I would add.
Has that changed? Have you seen an evolution in terms of
yes,
how Israeli Arabs identify themselves?
It does change in recent years. We highlighted it in our report last year. We see a sharp increase in the share of Arab Israelis who prefer to identify mostly as Arab Israelis or Israelis over identifying themselves as Palestinians. I should also say in answering Stu that there was not a question in our poll about this matter, but there was a question in the election about this matter. And the fact of the matter is that the largest Arab party today is the Arab party that decided to take the Palestinian issue out of the equation. The party that said, enough with the Palestinians, let's talk about ourselves and our role within Israeli society. That's today the largest Arab parties. And I think in this way, sometimes vote speaks louder than polls.
So thank you. I mean, it would have been useful, perhaps. You mentioned last year's.
Yeah, I put it on the screen for you.
Yeah, I just think it would have been useful to have it for this year as well. And that is very revealing and very important.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if there are questions, we have just a couple minutes. So if there's any burning questions, of course, you can email us with questions, read the report online. This is actually the first of a few papers that we'd like to write on this. Shmuel and I have lots of ideas of how we can further analyze the data. We really just scratched the surface. We've had the data for less than a month. So, we were able to do this. We do this in time for Yom Ha'atzmaut, but there's lots more coming. Scott.
Thank you. It was a brilliant presentation. A quick question based on something you just said at the beginning about the threat of the lack of cohesion and the degree to which that's a threat to the state. Based on the survey, but mostly your Noah and your Shmuel, mostly in terms of your knowledge of what the survey reflects, is there a role for outsiders, for the Jewish diaspora, for outside governments, for the United States, or is this lack of cohesion largely an internal issue that outsiders aren't really going to be able to help mitigate?
Noach, you want to answer this?
No,
Because I have no answer. Hi, Scott. It's good to see you. I'm not sure I have an answer for this one.
Yeah, I think it's beyond the scope of this presentation for sure, and it's something we need to investigate further. But I can't give an intelligent comment on that now. Yes, Erwin Kula.
Hi, very interesting. Any data, and I know this probably wasn't, this wasn't part of this, between the variety of different attitudes and sort of class issues, economic security, the precariousness of people's economic situations?
We did not include in our survey questions about the economic situation, but I can tell you that from other surveys, what we've seen in Israel in the past 2 years is somewhat similar to what you see in other countries, some type of apprehension because of COVID and the higher number of people who became unemployed. But as you probably know, Israel came back to almost regularity in the last couple of weeks. And as we see Israelis going back to work, as we see businesses open, and as we see economic factors recover, the level of apprehension of Israelis is going down. So again, we don't know what's going to be in the future with COVID, but if Israel is truly out of the pandemic or close to it, then economic issues are not the main. Israel is in a good economic situation, and I don't think these are the most dramatic divides or issues for Israelis right now.
Rabbi Ari Wicken, you asked a question about the more Jewish, less Jewish, and I hope Shmuel answered in the following slides. But basically, we asked people what it means to be a Jewish state, and by that we have an idea of, for them, what it means to be more Jewish or less Jewish. But if you have further questions, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question. I mean, building, I think, on what Erwin was just asking around the demographics, a further breakdown of the demographics of the Jewish respondents, like by age or geography. I'd be very curious to see, how 20-somethings responses compare to 60-somethings. And then I just wanted to highlight, I think, what Ambassador Eizenstat raised, which is the concern. I run a program right now. We have a cohort of 30-something-year-old Israelis in the Central Galilee and Detroiters, and they're meeting together, and that divergence amongst the non-Orthodox about what's important is really interesting to me. That like what the chances are, I'm sorry, of connection, and those two slides you showed of the right word and the left word, the mirror image, I think is the most critical or interesting as someone who works on that diaspora Israeli relationship, because it actually makes me feel quite anxious. It doesn't appear moving in the direction I would hope it from my chair.
Of course not, because it means that the people you find more easy to talk to are the people who don't care as much, and the people with which you have many difficulties and disagreements are the people who care more about other Jews. We have all the data on geography and ethnicity and age. I would say that most of it is not very important, especially you asked about age. Israel is not the United States. There is no, you don't see millennials here running around having completely different views than their parents. In Israel, the factor of age is of much less importance, and you should remember that the younger you get, the more conservative cohorts become larger. because we have many Orthodox and Dati youngsters. So you don't see the same kind of divergence between younger and older Israelis on most issues. I would give one exception, the issue of the rabbinate. Young seculars in Israel truly dislike the rabbinate with intensity that we did not see with their parents, to the extent that in one of our previous polls, we saw 70% of young Israelis, that is up to 27 or 28-year-old secular Israelis, who say they will not marry through the rabbinate. If that happens, that's very significant. I'm not sure it happens. I'm sure that this is what they say. So in this matter, the age does matter.
Can I just say one follow-up, and you might not have the answer, but when you started, you talked about the 4 tribes, and I'm sure we've all seen the Rivlin speech from IDC a number of years ago. You know, those of us in the sort of quote unquote liberal rabbinate in America think a lot about our counterparts in Israel, which I know are a small slice, very small of the population. But what is there information on the role of sort of people with emerging in that 5th space, maybe we could call it, around robust Jewish identity in a non-Dati manner?
Well, I would have you read my colleague Dan Pfefferman, who's on this as well. He's written extensively about this issue. You know, on this specific survey, it's not something we address. We have done a big, Shmuel and Camil did a big study on Israeli Judaism, and it touched on this, but I would have you follow up with my colleague Dan on that. Shmuel, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I'll just add that your counterparts in Israel are all Jews in Israel. I would not discount or decide in advance that you only speak to like-minded people in Israel, because you will end up speaking to fewer people. I think it is essential both for us as Israelis and for you as people who work in other places to try and find these common threads that we can pull to have a conversation between all Jews, whether they agree or disagree on matters of theology or politics or whatever it is.
Dan, did you want to say something about this real quick in response before we close it?
No, but I'm happy to speak with you, Rabbi Ari, offline, or to follow up on this if you wish.
All right. Well, I
So
don't.
Noah, let me make, if I may, just one
Please.
comment. I think Shmuel and Noah, it would be useful on the rabbi's point, and I know this decision came down probably after the survey, to get a sense of where Israeli Jews are on the Supreme Court's decision on conversion, and more generally, do they support what one would call more liberal interpretations of conversion, more acceptance of Jews who don't go through a strictly Orthodox conversion. And second, and more generally, Yedidia, I think that this is really such a rich survey. I hope that we can put this in, and there were 50 participants today, that we can put this in narrative form and distribute it to our whole mailing list, and perhaps get out an op-ed article published in the Israeli press or in some of the Jewish press here through JTA. So we get a wider distribution. It's really a very important survey, and it should be much more widely distributed.
It is. I do hope, by the way, that one of the things the survey is raising, and also Yedidia, your comments at the beginning, point to, okay, so we've seen what these tribes are, we see what the trends are. What are some of the proposed answers for building the bridges? Shmuel made the point in response to Rabbi Ari that for those in the diaspora, don't seek out those who are exactly your mirror image in Israel. Seek out those who are not there. Well, that may be one of the answers. What are some of the other answers or prospective suggestions?
If I may intervene, Noach, is it okay?
Yes, please.
Yeah. First of all, again, thank you everybody for participating, and thank you for the friends of JPPI that I see around here that support us in many ways. I would like to refer to the issue of conversions too that you mentioned, because it's a good example. I can promise you that if we will take each one of the Knesset members of the new Knesset from last week and give them a specific solution that I can give you right now as an example, and ask them to decide whether they support it or not, and allow them to vote in a way that it will not be disclosed to everybody else, in an anonymous way, without political pressure. I promise you that at least 75, if not more, will agree to this solution, including many religious, not the ultra-Orthodox, but many religious will agree to this kind of solution. This is one example for a general problem that, despite the fact that we do suffer from lack of cohesiveness, and we do have at least four different visions, we can come up with solutions on many of the major issues if we will be able to have a dialogue that will be sensitive to the main, I would say, not interest, but main ideologies of the other. The ground is full with solutions. The reason we are not being able to make this solution reality is the political system, Shmuel, and the fact that we have so many parties, and each party is crucial, and therefore you can never come up with a solution that majority will agree easily. I'll give you an example of the conversion. A few years ago, I was in one room with Bibi Netanyahu, who was then the prime minister, like today, and Tzipi Livni. She then was the head of Kadima, which was the largest party, actually. Together, Kadima and Likud had then more than 60 Knesset members. I talked to them about the conversion issues too, and gave them my idea what can be done. Two of them agreed. I felt, okay, there's a breakthrough, we have a solution. They looked at me and told me, each one of them in his or her way, how can I agree with you, despite the fact that this is a good solution, when the other might go with the Haredim for the next election, because I agreed to go with you. And each one of them said the same. So we do have a problem, a political problem. We can reach agreements, not on everything, but on many issues. What we need is a change in the governance of the State of Israel, or, if I may say so, leadership. Okay, I would like, talking about leadership, I would like to add by quoting to you what Ben-Gurion wrote, the ultimate leader, I would say, here in Israel, in one of his books. And Shimon Peres decided and asked that it will be written on his gravestone. Obviously, when Shimon Peres was thinking about what will be written on his gravestone, he gave it a lot of thought. So one of the things which is written there is a verse from Yeshayahu about peace. וכיתתו חרבותם לעתים וחנותיהם למזמרות, talking about peace. But what is the other one? Well, the other one is a quote from Ben-Gurion, and I will translate it for you. It's very relevant to what we had today. And this is the quote: "The spiritual essence of the state of Israel and its inner strength will be in the future the main factor in our security and in our international status." National resilience, according to Peres, and I totally agree, depends on our ability to act together, to function together despite the disputes. Think about this hand. Each one is a different tribe, but together we are one hand. And how can we recapture the feeling of solidarity, arvut hadadit, the ability to work together despite the differences of views? That's a main challenge. And I think we all in Israel, and maybe also you guys from outside of Israel may help us to do that. To me, JPPI should take the flag of cohesiveness and try to find ways of making reality in Israel as soon as possible. Anyhow, I want to thank everybody, and we'll meet more and more hopefully in the future. Noach, you have the last words.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you all again next year, or if not sooner. Next year in Jerusalem, hopefully, after 2 years of Zoom presentations, we'll do one in real life.